Hey there, YouTube. I'm Ikitsu. This is the Ikitsu Times. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to a little bit of Sins of a Solar Empire 2. So today we're going to be talking about TEC and their overall sort of faction and how it works as a whole, in my opinion, where they're strong, where they're weaker. This is a faction that I think is actually relatively straightforward. I know how to use them okay, but I would definitely not call myself the best expert with the faction there. So let's start by talking a little bit about how their economy works, because we did that with the Vasari. A little bit more straightforward with TEC, but they are known as the economy faction, and they are certainly the faction that is capable of putting the most investment into and getting the most rewards out of their economy, out of all the different factions. Now, they start off with a relatively okay amount of income, probably the best, depending on how you want to look at it, out of all the factions. I would say definitely the best overall economy out of all the three factions. Getting higher credits, but less of the metal and the crystal, but capable of ramping up fairly quickly in all of the categories that are involved. The big thing, though, for TEC is that they've got access to the trading outpost, which gives them additional resource generation at all of their gravity wells. Similar to Vasari, they're also capable of increasing the amount of stuff that they're allowed to put in orbit, which is a functional economy increase when you can account for the orbital structures being things like trading posts or for mining from asteroids or what have you. So either way you sort of go about it, TEC is capable of putting out the largest amount of economy out of all of the different factions there, and they get a huge amount of money as a result of this. However, that's not really how they work at the very, very beginning of the game. I'd say that out of all the factions, the TEC faction is the weakest out of the gate, because not only have they not ramped up their income to the huge level, their ships during the early game are by far the weakest out of all of them. Not even cost effective when you account for it that way. What does push them into the point where they're capable of becoming cost effective is when they've got discounts on their ships, which is much, much later in it. But more importantly, when they get access to shields. If they've got corvettes out and they're going corvette to corvette, they lose in pretty much all configurations until they get access to corvette shields, at which point they're much more cost effective than without them. Same thing with the Cobalt Light frigates, they're by far the weakest, and then you get the shields and suddenly they're relatively cost effective, losing, if I recall correctly, to the Disciple, but beating the Revestra Skirmisher. So those come in TEC 2 and require a pretty okay amount of investment, just so that you can get access to those shields for those very basic ships. That's putting them quite a bit behind compared to Vasari or Advent in terms of having to expend all of those resources just to catch up in terms of your cost effectiveness. Compound that with the fact that TEC, as I said, doesn't get their economy up right away. They've got a lot of things that they can do to ramp up their economy. They have to spend resources to increase their economy. So not only are you looking at a situation where you have to get to TEC 2 so you can get the shield so that you can fight cost effectively, not only are you looking at a situation where you have to TEC into the specific ships that you want to use to fight your opponent, you also have to build a lot of economy up at this point in time. Now, all the factions want to be building up economy at this point in time, but TEC has the most that they're capable of spending on economy out of all the different factions. If you're playing as Vasari, you've got your orbitals. That's pretty much what you prioritize. You can do your planetary boosts to economy. You can do a little bit of planetary construction for the slaves or whatever, but that's pretty much all you're spending as Vasari. For Advent, you're just trying to get the Tithe Sanctums and like just planetary upgrades, and that's basically it. You don't even usually go for orbitals as Advent until later than everybody else. But for TEC, you're really, really trying to get as much bonus income as you possibly can. So you can start ramping that up a little bit. Now, you can sort of soften that a little bit and still be okay, but the thing about TEC is that they're almost always losing fights when they sort of go toe-to-toe with an enemy, just because they don't have the same synergies as Advent, letting their ships outperform their own cost effectiveness. Their ships are, generally speaking, on their own as far as that goes, and they're not as strong pound for pound as Vasari ships, even though they can be as cost effective as Vasari ships. You end up in a situation where Vasari ships will outscale them into the later game, and they'll not really care as much about the fact that they're not as cost effective as TEC ships, because if both factions are at supply cap, what matters is how strong they are supply to supply. And TEC ships are not necessarily the strongest in the supply versus supply fights. They're generally speaking going to want to outnumber their opponent, and that doesn't happen in the hyper late game against Vasari. If they don't have that because everyone's at like 2,000 pop, then they're in potentially a little bit of trouble in those situations. So during this sort of section of the early game where you've got a fairly low population cap, you can't really get the largest numbers out there. You don't have the money to get those numbers anyway, and your ships are weaker pound for pound because they're missing a bunch of upgrades that they absolutely need. You're looking at a very, very tight rope that you have to walk. You've got to make sure that you're getting just enough defenses that you can survive this phase while getting enough economy up and running that you're going to be able to crush your opponent with sheer numbers if you get to the next phase of the game. There are ways to play them more aggressively if you really, really want to. I don't think that that's impossible, but I think the general play style for tech is usually going to resolve them getting into the higher tech tiers with a larger pool of money than anyone else can get and using superior numbers to win rather than the quality of their ships during the early game. If you do perfectly counter your opponent, though, you can go a little bit more on the offensive, but you do run that sort of risk of them seeing that you've got the counter unit and them sort of pulling back and investing on their own defenses, making it so that you will sort of have an advantage if you do manage to force a fight, but if they're doing it in your planetary defenses, that can be the end of a push for tech in general there. So during the early game, you've got access to your Cobalt Light frigates, which again, they're bad until you get access to the shields, at which point they become fairly okay. You've got access to the Garda Flak frigate, which is a very good point defense ship. If you're up against missiles or something like that, they're the perfect solution against those. You've got access to the Shriken, which is a really good anti-corvette, as well as being a good anti-frigate corvette. It's pretty strong into those two situations. You've got access to the Stylat, which is one of the very few early game anti-capitals and anti-cruiser type ships that's quite strong into those situations. They're a little bit redundant in that era because I think that the majority of situations you would actually prefer the Shriken's higher damage per second output during this early part of the game there. You've got access to the Pertrons, which are a pretty standard carrier. I don't think that they're super good for attack, but they do exist. You've got access to the Hoshiko. Again, I don't think that that's really great at this phase of the game, but you do have access to them, giving you a little bit of healing if you want to go for that sort of route there. And you've got access to the Caleb, which isn't particularly strong, but is one of the very few things in the game that just hard counters an early game triple capital rush from Vasari. So it does give you some options that are not normally available. You also, of course, have the Krosov being your planetary siege ship there. So the thing about the early game roster for tech is that they have a solution that is really, really, really strong against anything that your opponent can throw at you. If your opponent's throwing disciples at you, the Shriken is really quite good at dealing with those. If they're throwing the counterattack assailants at you, the Garda Flak frigate is the best early game point defense weapon against those. They're really, really good into that situation there. If you're getting hit by a spam of Revestra skirmishers, you could also use the Shriken there, I guess. If you're up against a whole bunch of capital ships, like I said, you could use the Caleb. You could also use the Stylat. They basically have a really, really strong answer for everything that can go up against them. And the reason that this is so important for tech is, like I said, they need to be spending their money in way too many different places all at once. So what they kind of want to be able to do is scout out the enemy and react to whatever it is that enemy is doing. That way they can build the bare minimum of the perfect counter ship to win against that foe in a fight while preserving as much money as possible to throw into their economy. I think that that is, generally speaking, what you're supposed to be doing as tech. They're generally speaking, what I feel to be the most reactive of the factions. Their ships, pound for pound, are not necessarily the strongest if they're not countering their opponent. Like I said, if you're running the Shriken and you've just gone for a huge spam of them, you've gone really, really hard on that really, really early, and you end up fighting against defensors, the defensors are going to win. You do have to get access to that shield bonus before you can actually fight that. And the Vasari player has that gigantic early game pool of resources, and if they threw all of that into defensors, they're going to crush you even if you just 100% threw every single cent that you're earning into Shriken. So even though the Shriken is really good into Corvettes and stuff like that, they're a good counter against them. They're not a counter against Corvettes that are good against other Corvettes as well. They're not capable of really out-punching in that sort of instance there, especially in early tech where you haven't got the shields yet. So Tech is really looking for a situation where they can sort of outpace their opponent in economy while just generally speaking getting the best counter to whatever they're having to fight against. That's my opinion about sort of how their early game works. Again, I do think that they're the weakest in the early game, but a lot of that comes down to, again, tempo, where I think that Tech is the one that's sort of forced to react to their opponent. Now, even if you're in a situation where like your opponent is going hard on their own economy, probably if you're up against, say, an Advent player, you do potentially want to be building up some military just in case they decide to get a little bit cheeky and throw in a bit of a minor attack against you at that point in the game. But your ideal situation is you're up against somebody who is going to let you build up your economy fairly freely. It's just you're going to have to keep your eyes open very, very carefully for that attack that could be coming for you at this stage of the game. The next phase, though, is where I think that you're the strongest. Getting into this sort of like latter parts of tier 2, when you've already got a whole bunch of your economy up and running, and you're heading into this like sort of tier 3, or when you're solidly tier 3, or when you're in early tier 4, I think that that's where Tech is the strongest. They're kind of on the classic bell curve where they start off low, they go really high, and then they drop down again. And I think that that's kind of fine. But the middle tier is where you're seeing like your economy sort of like rocketing ahead of everybody else's. And at this point in the game, you should be able to actually outproduce everybody else. Your ships at this phase of the game are the Harka Heavy Cruiser and the Javelus. Both of them are actually fairly good generalists, which I will talk a little bit more about that later. But the Harka has got really good damage and is very, very durable. The Javelus has very good damage and good penetration, pierce, as well as actually being surprisingly durable as well. So either of them can be just spammed fairly recklessly and will work into a large number of different types of compositions. There are certain situations where a more specialist response would be better. But generally speaking, if you just have lots of Harkas, lots of Javeluses, and you're using the fact that your economy is bigger than everyone else's, you can actually do a really strong sort of amount of pushing during this phase of the game. Heading into tier 4 early is also a possibility if you wanted to get that advantage. But basically, you're looking at a situation where the fact that you're earning more money than everybody else is really what is propelling you forward. The Harka is not like a fantastic ship. It's an okay ship. The Javelus is quite easily countered by enemy point defenses, which they could have access to in quite significant numbers. The Breaker Missile does help with that, but you're looking at a situation where your sort of mediocre ships, if you outnumber your opponent by enough mass, the fact that you've got that ability to outmass your opponent, you're going to be able to push through them anyway. One thing that could potentially happen is, like, you could be in this phase of the game, you've got your 1,500 population way before your opponent's capable of getting to that number. They could have something like 1,000 supply, and you could basically trade your navies against each other. And maybe you preserve like 500, they preserve maybe like 500. But by the time you've built up to 1,500 again, they haven't rebuilt to 1,000. They've probably rebuilt to like 750 or something like that in the same amount of time that you've gone like back up to the full amount there. And so you fight again, and you gradually sort of like knock them down from that sort of like amount that they're capable of getting, but every time you bounce back to your full potential, but every time they're having trouble catching up. So that's kind of, I think, one of the things that you can do as Tech that no one else can really keep up with, because their economies just aren't fast enough to allow them that sort of style of fighting. They also have the ability to do that with their capital ships, which no one else can do, because they can get the exotics back from losing capitals. Although, no matter what faction you are, you should be avoiding losing your capitals wherever possible, simply retreating them before they get destroyed. So at this stage of the game, I think that this is where Tech is strongest. They've got really good solutions if they need more specialized ships. They've got good generalists, and they've got the ability to have more than their opponent does, regardless of what it is that their opponent's throwing at them. Heading into Tier 4, I would still say that you're pretty strong at the sort of early parts of the later game. Neither faction should expect to be at their like sort of population cap, even though you can unlock that population cap. You should be getting there faster to the population cap as Tech. And again, if you've got 2,000 supply and your opponent's only got 1,500, you're still probably actually going to not necessarily, you might not decisively win that fight against an Advent player or a Visari player. 2,000 supply of Tech ships is not necessarily going to sweep through 1,500 of either of the other two. But if you trade down enough times and bounce back up to the full strength every time, and they can't bounce back, then you're coming out ahead. Like you just have to keep bouncing back and keep throwing stuff at them, keeping that momentum going, keeping your industrial might churning out ships. Then you can end up in absolutely a situation where you win that game, even though you're not winning those fights very decisively, even though you outnumber your opponent, just because they'll never be able to catch up to you in terms of numbers. This can backfire against Vasari if they've got very good debris reclamation and stuff like that, and this can backfire against Advent Reborn. But other than those situations, this can be definitely a situation where you can just grind through your opponent still by tier 4. You're also getting access, of course, to your command ships and to your Titan. And while I do think that you don't necessarily have the strongest command ships or Titans, they are very good ones. I don't think they're the strongest. As TEC, you are likely going to be one of the ones that can get them fastest, simply because you're going to have that higher economy, and that does give you the ability to produce or purchase those exotics a little bit more easily than some of the other factions can. About the only one that can get the exotics as fast as you, it was a really, really lucky Vasari Alliance player. But basically, other than that, realistically speaking, you're going to be the one that's got the easiest and fastest access to those Titans or command ships, which can give you a pretty interesting lead into those scenarios there. You also have access to the Ogrov. The Ogrov runs into the problem that while it is very good into command ships, Titans, even capitals, in certain circumstances there, and of course star bases, you're not going to be able to easily mass a lot of Ogrovs very effectively without really hurting yourself elsewhere, because what you would have to do is build a ton of exotics refineries and then have all of them churning out exotics for the Ogrovs, which would be a tremendous waste compared to getting like a Ragnarov or any of the other sort of like big ships that you could be getting, or even just capital ships would be better in a lot of senses than trying to spam Ogrovs. Now, there are certain circumstances where you can absolutely spam Ogrovs and get absolutely tons of them, and it would be after you've gotten those command ships in your Titan. But prior to that, during the sort of earlier parts of the late game, it's not really practical to try and spam out Ogrovs. It's just really not something that I would recommend doing necessarily. Even if you needed to destroy a starbase, I think that the command ship and the Titan are better into that situation, because then you'll still have something that's also really good into the entire enemy fleet and not just a few specific select targets there. So by the time you hit that late game, I was sort of implying this earlier, but you're running into a situation where like you've got your Titans and all your command ships, you've got lots of capitals, you've got like a full 2,000 supply fleet, but you're also running into a situation where your opponent's got like that full 2,000 supply fleet. They've got their Titan, they've got their command ships, they've got lots of capital ships. In that instance, like 2,000 supply of TEC, I expect to get run over pretty badly by a fully leveled, fully upgraded, fully itemized Advent fleet or Vasari fleet. Not only are they going to get run over in that situation, generally speaking, I think that they're also going to have a harder time recovering from it in a way that's meaningful. Generally speaking, I think that what's going to happen is you're going to get run over by like that Advent or that Vasari fleet, and they're going to run over you by such a percentage that they still have enough fleet that they can run over another one of your fleets, and then another one, and then another one, and they're going to be able to replenish their losses fast enough that they're not going to slow down. And at that point in time, a TEC player is basically done for. The only really sort of saving grace that they've got at this point in time is if you're playing as TEC Enclave, you've got access to the double star bases and you've got access to Garrison Mechanic. And that will potentially give you enough of an edge that you can win a fight in that hyper late game environment. But I do think that you're on a bit of a timer with TEC. Once you hit that late game, you do want to close the game out or get as much of a decisive advantage as you can. If you do get enough of a decisive edge to where your opponent can't really fight back effectively against you, then you're still going to be fine even to that hyper late game, because you'll have reached hyper late game and your opponent will not have. But generally speaking, I think that you want to sort of close out the games before you can get there, because your super late game is kind of weaker than TEC or Advent or Vasari. Now, you do also have access to the Novolith. I think that Novoliths, as they sort of get into the hyper late game, aren't really a good equalizer, because you're going to be fighting into more planetary shields. So if everything's just got planetary shields, then obviously like the Novoliths don't really matter. And since you're getting like your planet's pushed into by your opponent, who's likely going to be able to sort of beat you up, you're probably not going to have like a ton of novelists that are all surviving every fight there. And if you invested early on into a whole bunch of novelists, you run that sort of risk of just getting rolled over by your opponent, because instead of having that 1,500 population against your opponent's 1,000 population, what you're going to have is 1,000 population versus 1,000 population, at which point your opponent rolls over you way earlier than if you don't commit to using Novolith. So there's a real risk of running those. The other thing about these guys, their upgrades as they scale into the sort of later game don't keep up with either Advent or Visari. In general speaking, there, like some of them do. The refined propellants does exceed the laser bonus for Advent. Except when you count for their passive, at which point they're 1 point behind. Their like missiles are 6% behind or something like that. Their beams barely get anything. Their like Gauss weapons get basically nothing. So they're way behind in terms of their sort of scaling in that sort of sense there. And even their armor and hull points don't really scale quite as well as their adversaries. Since their armor values, just they get that from their passive, and it only goes up by like plus 15%. The armor strength being their really big saving grace, there being a really, really strong bonus for them. But basically, like as the game goes later on, your ships become less and less cost effective relative to your opponents as well. So there's a lot of things conspiring against you by the time you hit the super late game. Advent and their sort of death ball is going to have these sort of hyper synergies where their ships become like infinitely stronger than they would be if they were by themselves. Visari ships have outscaled you just from like their phase resonance as well as their higher upgrades from their tech. Advent items are ridiculously broken, and they're going to have access to all of those. And you're just not going to have anything that can really quite keep up with any of that sort of stuff there. So you're really going to want to sort of win earlier than that. Now, I do think that it's actually fine for a faction to have a sort of like bell curve kind of strength, and that's kind of what you got with tech. But I do think that it would be nice if they had a slightly easier time during the very beginning of the game. I don't know how you would do that without making them potentially too powerful for really, really proficient players. But I think that tech is supposed to be the most forgiving and beginner friendly of the different factions there. And the fact that they need to have like these very sort of well timed and well executed openings where they've got a lot of different things they have to juggle. They've got a lot on their plate, and there's a lot that they need to invest in with a very limited pool of opening resources. Does make it harder for newer players to play them at a sort of like competitive level. Whereas it's not that hard to juggle all your priorities as a Visari player during the early game. It's not that hard to juggle all your priorities in the early game as Advent, because you're kind of more constrained in the options that you have, and those options are just default stronger than what tech is running. So even if you screw up and don't get like the perfect counter, you'll still be able to pull ahead of your opponent there. Like, let's take, for example, you're playing as tech and you're up against an Advent player, and you both go for your basic frigate. You're going to get crushed by Disciples. Like, Disciples will just smush a player who's gone heavily into Cobalts without the player getting those shields and all that other stuff. And if they do get shields and you're both like sort of all inning one another, the Disciples are still going to win because they're going to have that sort of edge in terms of how much they're able to produce because they didn't need to tech up as much, or they teched up into better upgrades since they didn't have to get the shield bonus. And even with the shield bonus, the Disciple is a little bit stronger per cost than the Cobalt is. So there's a lot going against you in that sort of instance there. So you do have to be very, very careful about how you prioritize things as tech compared to the other factions during that early section of the game. And if you get it right, you know you're going to be fine. And if you get it wrong, you're in a lot more trouble with tech than you would be with the other two factions there. The other thing that I think is not quite right about tech is the way that they sort of have their units statted and how they function. It's very obvious to me that the way that tech should function, the way they've designed their ships and the way that their fleet doctrine looks like it should work, is they should have like a bunch of very durable ships that form their front line, and they should have very high damage dealers in the back line that are capable of using their longer range and higher damage to deal damage to the enemy there. But you get to tier 3 and you see something interesting going on. You've got the Harka, which has very good durability, but it also has really good damage. And it's relatively inexpensive there. So it's a pretty okay ship in a lot of ways there, but it's like a brick that is capable of dealing damage. And then you look at their other ship, the Javelus. It's actually also really durable. It's also really quite hard to kill a Javelus, and its damage is actually pretty comparable to a Harka's in a lot of ways. Now, obviously, the Javelus has got much better Pierce, and they've got access to the Breaker Missile, which again has much better Pierce. But ultimately, they're both like fairly high damage, fairly tough, very brick-like ships that are capable of absorbing a lot of damage. Now, obviously, if you're going to tank with something, you'd rather it be the Harka, and obviously, if you're going to be hitting a target, you'd rather it be with the Javelus under normal circumstances. But that kind of thing is happening across like a lot of the roster. The Caleb isn't really that much more fragile or anything like that than the Cobalt, and its damage is actually pretty low. You've got all sorts of situations where ships are kind of like tougher than they really should be, and their guns don't hit quite as hard as you would expect them to. Whereas what I think you would want is something like the Javelus to be really quite fragile compared to what it is, but have a really, really good missile attack there. You'd want the Calebs to be similar. You'd want them to be a really, really light ship that's easily destroyed, but you'd want to have that really good range, as well as that high Pierce that's capable of dealing that damage to capital ships. The reason that the ships cannot work this way is because of how the core mechanics of Sins of Solar Empire 2 work as a whole, where it doesn't matter that you've got a front line of Harkas. I don't have to care about them. I can still just go after the Javeluses. I can just go right after them. There's nothing they can really do about that. The Calebs have to be sort of cheap. They have to be a little bit durable. They can't have the best damage because the same thing is going to happen. They're just going to have ships roll straight up to them. They're going to kill them if they've got like different stats than what they've currently got. Similarly, those frontline ships have to have relatively decent damage output when they shouldn't really have that. Things like the Harka don't need to be that high damage potential, etc., etc. And the reason that they have got that damage is because if they are just tough, they aren't really performing any function. If they've got that durability but no damage, then they can. If they had like infinite durability but zero damage, you could just safely ignore them. So they have to have enough damage that they pose a credible threat. So you can't really do the tough ship frontline, the fragile high damage backline, which I think is the most sort of basic style of play for this kind of game and the most sort of like intuitive way that you would play it. That doesn't really work in this style of game. And I think there is a potential ability that you could add to TEC that would make it so that they can do that. So I think if they gave a tier 3 TEC to the Harka and you had like the Harka and just moved their TEC like directly below it so it's capable of getting at the same level as the Harka itself, with fairly wide radius ability that slows down everything in that radius as a toggle. And what I would say that you would want for this, because you don't want people to just be able to get one single Harka and have it like slow down everything by itself. You would want to make it so that it's like 2% speed reduction per Harka to a maximum of minus 100%, because minus 100% speed means that you're moving at half speed, as far as I remember how this game's mechanics work. And I would have it so that the toggle, when it's activated, makes it so that the Harka has half damage as well. And the reason that I think that this would do something is you'd have this big wall of Harkas, or you'd have it mixed in maybe with some Gardas or some Cobalts or whatever, but for the most part, you'd have that sort of wall of Harkas, that big grindy wall that the enemy has to blow their way through slowly. And they have to make a choice there at that point in time, where they're either destroying all of the Harkas so that they can make it through, suddenly burst through and instantly kill everything behind it once there's a certain sort of massive Harkas missing, or they can try to force their way forward through the Harkas, in which case they're taking a huge amount of damage because they're moving really, really slowly. And while they're slowed down, it's giving you a lot of time to deal damage to those approaching ships, potentially killing them all, and giving you time to sort of like let your more fragile backline ships do a lot of damage anyway. So it would create some more interesting ways of playing it as well, since, like I said, I think that should be a slowdown for all ships, including your friendlies. I think it should also apply to ordnance, fighter craft, so the enemy can't just have a bunch of bombers skip past the Harkas with no consequence and then just immediately blow up all of the things that they're guarding anyway. If the fighters are forced to slowly go through there while there's like Gardos mixed in there, that makes it so that you've got the ability again to do a lot more damage to those fighters. It gives you more time for your backline to sort of operate before they go down. Same thing for your own missiles, though. If you're guarding a bunch of Javelises, you run that sort of problem of your own missiles are being slowed down. If the enemy has point defense, then suddenly you've got a situation where your missiles being slowed down is really, really catastrophically bad. So you've got interesting choices that you have to sort of make in that situation there. You've got pros and cons that you have to sort of balance. Now, is this strictly speaking necessary? No, you can't just make it so that all of TEC's ships do high damage and all of them have high durability. I think that that's a little bit boring in a certain way there, but TEC's roster is kind of meant to be a little bit boring. So, or at least it's boring for people like me who likes the fancy exotics kind of stuff. So I think that there's definitely an argument to say that they should just keep their doctrine exactly the same. But I definitely think that for a lot of people, the most intuitive way to play them should be rewarded to a certain degree, where you've got like tough, beefy ships up the front there, and they're guarding the ships that are behind them. And right now, the mechanics of the game don't really allow that to happen with any of the sub-capitals. And even the capitals don't necessarily have the ability to sort of swap towards that sort of style there. So yeah, I think that would be a change that I would consider. Now, I've sort of mentioned the roster for the TEC faction is very, very vast. It's very complete. The one thing that's technically kind of missing is they are short one support ship compared to the other factions, but their roster of ships is actually the largest already, so they may not necessarily need that. And again, they're not really a synergistic faction, so I don't necessarily know that they need to be given access to an additional support type ship. And if you consider TEC primacy, they even have like 3 additional types of ships there, even though they're kind of reskins of existing ones. They do have slight differences. So the amount of ships that you have access to as TEC, you're already spoiled for choice compared to everyone else. But if I was going to add a new class of ship to TEC, some kind of support type ship would definitely be the right call for them. I don't know what you would add to them, though. I wouldn't want it to be some sort of shield blocker thing that makes it so that you can defend your backline ships, because that's Advent's thing. I wouldn't want it to be like a wall of projection type thing, maybe. I think that again, is too similar to what Advent already kind of does. I'm not really sure exactly what you would want to do with TEC if you added a new ship, because again, their roster is very complete. They don't really need anything new, strictly speaking, there. But yeah, that's kind of what I've got to say about TEC. I think that they're a pretty okay faction. I don't find them the most interesting to play personally, but I do think that they're relatively easy to pick up and relatively easy to use. And I think that that's going to be appealing to a lot of people. The fact that they operate in one of the more intuitive ways out there, I think, is also pretty good for newer players out there as well. So in any event, though, that's going to be our video for today. I hope you found this one enjoyable. And of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.